Hello, welcome back. Alexandrian Codex, Che Guevara, Guerrilla Warfare, Section 5, Warfare on Unfavorable Ground. In order to carry out warfare in country that's not very hilly, lacks forests, has many roads, all the fundamental requisites of guerrilla warfare must be observed. Only the forms will be altered. The quantity, not the quality, of guerrilla warfare will change. For example, following in the same order as before, the mobility of this type of guerrilla should be extraordinary. Strikes should be made preferably at night. They should be extremely rapid, but the guerrilla should move to places different from the starting point, the furthest possible from the scene of action, assuming there's no place secure from the oppressive forces that the guerrilla can use as a garrison. So when you don't have forests or mountains or whatever else to obfuscate your movement, you don't want to go back to the same place. You want to always be on the move. Because, as I talked about earlier, if you are operating from a single point, it's really easy to take those points of interaction and triangulate or project where the base of operations is. A man can walk between 30 and 50 kilometers during the night. It's possible to also march during the first hours of daylight, unless the zones of operation are closely watched or there's a danger of people in the vicinity seeing passing troops. We'll notify the pursuing army of the location of the guerrilla band and its route. It's always preferable in these cases to operate at night with the greatest possible silence, but before and after the action. The first hours of night are the best. Here, too, there are exceptions to the general rule, since at times dawn hours will be preferable. It's never wise to habituate the enemy to a certain form of warfare. It's necessary to vary constantly the places, the hours, and the form of operation. Again, calling back to Chapter 1, calling back to the Art of War, you gotta keep them on their toes. Never do the same thing twice, or try not to do the same thing twice, because once you form a pattern, we're very good creatures at figuring out patterns and making deductions based off them. We've already said that an action cannot endure for long, but must be rapid. Must be of high degree of effectiveness. Last a few minutes, and be followed by an immediate withdrawal. There's a sex joke in there. The armies employed here will not be the same as the case of actions on favorable ground. Large quantity of automatic weapons is to be preferred. In night attacks, marksmanship is not a determining factor, but rather a concentration of fire. The more automatic arms firing at short distance, the more possibilities there are of annihilating the enemy. Now, this is a total 180 from what he's been saying up until this point. Also, the use of mines and roads and destruction of bridges are tactics of great importance. Attacks by the guerrilla will be less aggressive so far as the persistence and continuation are concerned, but they can be very violent. They can utilize different arms, such as mines and the shotgun, against open vehicles heavily loaded with men, which is the usual method of transporting troops, and even against closed vehicles that do not have special defenses. Against buses, for example, the shotgun is a tremendous weapon. God, that's dark. that's incredibly dark. Yeah. I don't know why that's so much more of a visceral image to me, but it definitely is. A shotgun loaded with large stock is most effective. This is not a secret of guerrilla fighters, it's also used in big wars. The Americans use shotgun platoons armed with high-quality weapons and bayonets for assaulting machine gun nests. Bunker busters, yeah. There is an important problem to explain, that of ammunition, and this will always be taken from the enemy. Again, just hounding on this point because it's one of his three most essential things that you absolutely must understand. It's therefore necessary to strike blows where there will be an absolute assurance of restoring the ammunition expended, unless there are large reserves in secure places. In other words, an annihilating attack against a group of men is not to be undertaken at the risk of expending all ammunition without being able to replace it. Always in guerrilla tactics, it's necessary to keep in mind the great problem of procuring war materiel necessary for continuing the fight. For this reason, guerrilla arms ought to be the same as those used by the enemy, except for weapons such as revolvers and shotguns, for which ammunition can be obtained in the zone itself or in the cities. The number of men that a guerrilla band in this type should not exceed 10 or 15. In forming a single combat unit, It's of great importance to consider the limitations on number. 10, 12, 15 men can hide just about anywhere. At the same time, can help each other in putting up a powerful resistance to the enemy. 4 or 5 would perhaps be too small a number, but when the number exceeds 10, the possibility that the enemy will discover them in the camp or on the march is much greater. Remember that the velocity of the guerrilla band on the march is equal to the velocity of its slowest man. It's more difficult to find uniformity of marching speed with 20, 30, or 40 men than with 10. The guerrilla fighter on the plain must be fundamentally a runner. Here, the practice of hitting and running acquires its maximum use. The guerrilla bands on the plains suffer the enormous inconvenience of being subject to rapid encirclement and not having sure places where they can set up a firm resistance. Therefore, they must live in conditions of absolute secrecy for a long time, since it would be dangerous to trust any neighbor whose fidelity is not perfectly established. The reprisals of the enemy are so violent, usually so brutal, inflicted not only on the head of the family, but frequently on women and children as well, that pressures on individuals lacking firmness may result at any moment in their giving way and revealing information as to where the guerrilla band is located and how it's operating. This would immediately produce an encirclement with consequences always disagreeable, although not necessarily fatal. When conditions, the quantity of arms, the state of the insurrection of the people call for an increase in the number of men, the guerrilla band should be divided. If it is necessary, all can rejoin at a given moment to deal a blow, but in such a way that immediately afterwards they disperse towards separate zones, again divided into small groups of 10, 12, or 15. Now this reflects what he's talked about before, although this is on a much, much smaller level. Rather than a band being up to 25 or more and having clusters of those, it's clusters of maybe 10. Maybe just gangs, basically. Very small gangs or squads or whatever you want to imagine them as. Very small units. Yeah, it's very logical. It definitely carries. And I know this was a few paragraphs back, but I was thinking about it while reading the emphasis he places on an engagement not being worth it unless you can assume or assure that you get your ammunition back, ammunition's worth out of it, is quite interesting. Because it raises questions for me. For example, so like he's talking really short range then, because not only do you have to intercept someone or ammunition being moved, not only do you have to engage the enemy at engage them and take them down, but because they can be reinforced so quickly, you then have to get to them, get the ammo off of them or out of the truck or out of whatever, and then get the fuck out. So attacking at long range through like snipers, well, you can take people out, but their comrades or reinforcements or whatever else are likely to get to the body before you do, and well, you're not getting ammo that way, right? And it's interesting. It's really interesting because in wars of attrition, there we go. In modern wars of attrition, utilization of snipers or individual marksmen has been an instrumental tool in the Second World War and in most wars after it, in insurgencies all over the place. And it's interesting that he doesn't say it explicitly here, but a lone gunman is not effectively engaging in guerrilla warfare. It doesn't matter how many people you kill, it doesn't matter what your kill to death ratio is, right? It doesn't matter how efficient you are with your ammunition. What matters is procuring the elements, the material necessary to sustain and prolong the conflict. Well, and move the needle forward, if you will. Yeah, yeah, it's quite interesting. Using this framework, um, individuals who are again the lone gunman type aren't really contributing to the guerrilla band's momentum or progress or success. Yeah, I don't remember if he talks about this, but I have questions about that now. I really would like to see him speak about that. Can't remember if he does. Again, it's been like more than 10 years since I've read this. It's entirely feasible to organize whole armies under a single command and to assure respect and obedience to this command without the necessity of being in a single group. Therefore, the election of guerrilla chiefs and the certainty that they will coordinate ideologically and personally with the overall chief of the zone are very important. The bazooka is a heavy weapon that can be used by a guerrilla band and because of its easy portability and operation. Today, the rifle-fired anti-tank grenade can replace it. Naturally, it will be a weapon taken from the enemy. Bazooka is ideal for firing on armored vehicles or even unarmored vehicles that are loaded with troops for taking small military bases of a few men in a short time, but it's important to point out that not more than 3 shells per man can be carried, and this with only a considerable exertion. As for the utilization of heavy arms taken from the enemy, naturally nothing is to be scorned, but there are weapons such as tripod machine guns, 50mm machine guns, etc., that when captured can be utilized with a willingness to lose them again. In other words, in the unfavorable conditions we're now analyzing, a battle to defend a heavy machine gun or other weapon of this type cannot be allowed. They're simply to be used until the tactical moment that they must be abandoned. In the Cuban War of Liberation, to abandon a weapon constituted a grave offense, and there was never a case where the necessity arose. Nevertheless, we mention this in order to clearly explain the only situation in which abandonment would not constitute an occasion for reproach. On unfavorable ground, the guerrilla weapon is a personal weapon of rapid fire. Easy access to the zone usually means it'll be habitable, and there will be a peasant population in these places. This facilitates supply enormously. Having trustworthy people and making contact with establishments that provide supplies to the population, it's possible to maintain a guerrilla band perfectly well without having to devote time or money to long and dangerous lines of communication. Also, it's well to reiterate that the number of essential men, the smaller the number of essential men, the easier it is to procure food for them. Supplies such as bedding, waterproof material, mosquito netting, shoes, medicine, will all be found directly in the zone, since they're things of daily use by its inhabitants. Communications will be much easier in the sense of being able to count on a larger number of men and more roads, but they'll be more difficult. There's a problem of security for messages between distant points, since it becomes necessary to rely on a series of contacts that have to be trusted. There will be the danger of an eventual capture of one of the messengers, who are constantly crossing enemy zones. If the messengers are of small importance, they should be oral, or of great importance, code should be used. Experience shows that transmission by word of mouth greatly distorts any communication. That's why we play telephone as kids, to teach us this very important lesson that write it down. Word of mouth is wildly inefficient. Even if we hear the same words, we can distort and misinterpret their meaning, and our memory is not the best thing in the world. For these same reasons, manufacture will have to be much less important. At the same time, it wouldn't be much more difficult to carry out. No, it would be much more difficult to carry out. It will not be possible to have factories making shoes or arms. Practically speaking, manufacture will have to be limited to small shops, carefully hidden where shotgun shells can be recharged, mines, simple grenades, other minimum necessities of the moment manufactured. On the other hand, it's possible to make use of friendly shops in the zone for work as necessary. This brings us to 2 consequences that flow logically from what's being said. One of them is favorable conditions for establishing a permanent camp in guerrilla warfare are inverse to the degree of productive development of the place. All favorable conditions, all facilities of life normally induce men to settle. But for the guerrilla band, the opposite is the case. the more facilities there are for social life, the more nomadic, the more uncertain the life of the guerrilla fighter. These really are results of one and the same principle. The title of this section is War on Unfavorable Ground because everything that is favorable to human life, communications, urban, semi-urban concentrations, a large number of people, land easily worked by machine, all these places, to the guerrilla fighter, are a disadvantageous situation. The second conclusion is that if a guerrilla fighting must include the extremely important factor of work on the masses, this work is even more important in unfavorable zones, where a single enemy attack can produce a catastrophe. Indoctrination should be continuous. It should be so that the struggle for unity of the workers, of the peasants, and the other social classes that live in the zone in order to achieve toward guerrilla fighters a maximum homogeneity of attitude. I don't know why he didn't say hegemony of attitude, but okay, sure. It's a potato. There's probably some minor distinction between homogeneity, and I can't say that word, and hegemony, but well, one is like a shared consciousness and ideal, and another is a power or norm or influence enforcing a norm. Yeah. I'm articulate today. The task with the masses, this constant work of the huge problem of relations with the guerrilla band, with the inhabitants of the zone, must also govern the attitude to be taken towards the case of individual recalcitrant enemy soldiers. Should they be eliminated without hesitation when they're dangerous? In this respect, the guerrilla ban must be drastic. Enemies cannot be permitted to exist within the zone of operations in places that offer no security. Now this is a far cry from what he talked about prior. Was to treat them well, to operate essentially by the Geneva Convention, so as to not damage the reputation of the guerrilla band. But in Che's mind, you reach a certain point when that reputation is less important than security. When it comes down to the point where you are put in danger by someone's survival, apparently that's Che's line. I can't speak to that, obviously. But it's noteworthy because it is a drastic change in tone, and it's in the first few sections. I say chapters, these are sections. I think he might have called them chapters, but you damn little fly. My gotcha. A couple of my ivy plants are still dying, so these little bastards are loving killing them and driving me slowly insane. Well, not killing them, eating the dead plant stuff that I should just get rid of. But it's beside the point. Chase starts out talking about the guerrilla band and the guerrilla fighter is valorous and virtuous, like a knight, chivalrous. And he's been walking that back a little bit. Now Che would certainly still argue by the end of this section that he would advocate for that sort of thing. But, well, he's talked about the necessity, the occasional justification for collateral damage, right, on civilian targets, if you're trying to take out an important figurehead of the occupying force. And here he's talking about, well, sometimes, and he says it very briefly, but sometimes it's more important to ensure your security than the sanctity of human life. And yeah, that's very different. And of course, these are hard, difficult calls to make, particularly when you are in the circumstances that a guerrilla fighter would be. But it is a noteworthy departure, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Well, this one was about 20 minutes. Not the 15 of last time, but it's better. It's better. I'm putting in a cut here Till tomorrow, toodaloo, take care, see you then, and bye-bye.